Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're really getting into it, tackling free speech. It's always a hot topic. And to really dig in, we're looking at a fascinating Joe Rogan Experience episode with guest Michael Shellenberger.
And they don't waste any time getting to the heart of it. Rogan kicks things off with a real-world situation, a massive free speech protest down in Brazil. Naturally, this caught the eye of none other than Elon Musk.
Musk, always at the center of these things. But this situation is particularly interesting because, as we know, he's now in charge of X, formerly Twitter.
No.
And the Brazilian government basically threw down the gauntlet, censor what we deem as misinformation, or face X being blocked in the entire country.
Talk about pressure. It really underscores the global struggle over controlling information online. Governments claiming they need to step in to stop misinformation, especially in the wake of things like, the whole COVID situation. But then on the flip side, you have those who see this as a dangerous step towards censorship.
It makes you think, where do you draw that line? What's the balance between protecting people from harmful content and, allowing for open discourse? It's tricky.
Absolutely. And what Rogan and Shellenberger point out is that the very definition of free speech seems to be in flux. Historically, they argue it was often those on the right who were more associated with censorship, trying to suppress ideas they didn't agree with. But now, it seems like the tables have turned.
Yeah, it's like a pendulum swing. Now you see a lot of concern about censorship coming from those on the left, especially when it comes to, say, populist leaders or ideas that challenge the mainstream narrative.
It's a fascinating shift. And it's something that Shellenberger has some personal experience with. He's now at the University of Austin. And this is significant because the university itself was founded with a strong emphasis on free speech.
It's like they're saying, hey, we need a space where these conversations can happen openly and honestly. And this whole debate, it's not just a product of the internet age either. Think way back. The invention of the printing press. At first, the Catholic Church was all for it.
It's spread the good word, right? But then along comes Martin Luther, using that same technology to challenge the church's authority. Suddenly, that tool they embraced became a threat.
And thus began the attempts to control the printing press, to censor those challenging the status quo. It's a tale as old as time, isn't it?
It really is. And it highlights how the desire to control information is ultimately about power. And Rogan and Shellenberger, they don't shy away from naming names when it comes to who they believe is wielding that power today. They call out Bill Gates.
Bill Gates. Not just for his wealth and influence, but for specific statements he's made that seem to suggest support for controlling certain narratives.
They bring up his Netflix documentary where he appears to advocate for censorship as a way to combat misinformation, especially surrounding vaccines, which of course begs the question, who gets to decide what constitutes misinformation?
It's a slippery slope, right? Because on the one hand, you have the potential for genuinely harmful information to spread and cause real damage. But on the other, you have the potential for censorship to be used to silence dissent or control the narrative to serve certain interests. Where do you even begin to find the balance?
It's incredibly complex. And what Rogan and Shellenberger find particularly noteworthy is the lack of mainstream media attention this issue has received. Gates made these statements publicly, yet it seems to have flown under the radar for many.
Which makes you wonder what else we're not hearing, right? What information is being filtered out and why?
It's a question that leads us to Shellenberger's book, Pathocracy. Ever heard that term before?
Can't say I have.
It basically describes a situation where the institutions designed to solve problems end up causing more harm than good. The cure being worse than the disease, And he uses a term to illustrate this, iatrogenesis.
Iatrogenesis. I say that 3 times fast. So what does it mean?
Basically, it refers to harm caused by the healer. And Shellenberger doesn't use this term lightly. He applies it to powerful organizations like, surprisingly, the American Academy of Pediatrics. They actually put out some advice over the years that, while well-intentioned, turned out to be quite detrimental.
Oh, really? Like what?
Remember when they told parents to have babies sleep on their stomachs? That actually contributed to cases of sudden infant death syndrome, or the stance on peanuts. Probably played a role in the rise of peanut allergies.
It's a good reminder that we can't blindly trust any institution, even those we assume have our best interests at heart. But if we can't rely on institutions, then who or what can we trust? We'll dive deeper into that question and more right after this. So we've been talking about institutions and trust, and it got me thinking about another area where those ideas get really sticky, drug use. Rogan and Shellenberger go there, of course, and it gets pretty interesting.
It's definitely a topic that sparks a lot of debate, and they don't shy away from it. What's interesting is how they frame the conversation. It's less about whether specific substances are inherently good or bad, and more about personal responsibility versus, like, government control. Rogan, as you might expect, leans heavily on the individual freedom side of things.
Yeah, the whole libertarian ethos comes out. He actually compares it to gambling. It can be addictive, right? It can ruin people's lives, but it's legal.
Hmm.
So his point seems to be, why should other potentially harmful activities, like using drugs, be treated any differently? It's a tough one.
Definitely. And Schellenberger doesn't let him off the hook. He pushes back, arguing that the potential consequences of something like, say, legalizing heroin are far more severe and far-reaching than something like gambling.
And he brings up the opioid epidemic, which is a sobering reminder of just how bad things can get, even with legal substances. It's a really thorny issue because, on the one hand, there's the argument that adults should have the freedom to make their own choices, even if those choices carry some inherent risk, right?
Right. But on the other, you have the very real concerns about addiction, overdoses, and the strain on public health systems. And it gets even more nuanced when you bring psychedelics into the mix, which, of course, Rogan and Schellenberger spend a good chunk of time on.
Yeah, Rogan is a big advocate for exploring the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, especially for things like PTSD. He talks about these veterans who've used psychedelics and found relief in ways traditional therapy just couldn't touch. Is that something you've come across in your research too?
Absolutely. The potential therapeutic benefits are a major argument for at least reconsidering the legal status of psychedelics.
Yeah.
But as with any substance, it's not without its risks.
Exactly. Not everyone has positive experiences with psychedelics, and there's still so much we don't know about the long-term effects. It seems like, yet again, we're back to finding that balance. How do you weigh potential benefits against potential harms?
And when you're dealing with something as personal and subjective as drug use, finding those black and white answers, those universal truths, if you will, it becomes even more elusive.
Which, in a weird way, brings us to the last and maybe wildest part of their conversation: conspiracy theories.
It's a heck of a transition, right? They go from debating drug laws to, like, full-on UFO sightings and government cover-ups. Rogan's got quite the range, I'll give him that.
That's Rogan for you. It's like he sees connections everywhere, even in the most unexpected places. But in all seriousness, they touch on something that's really thought-provoking. This idea that there are forces out there deliberately spreading misinformation, creating these, like, elaborate scoops, as they call them.
And this is where it gets kind of meta. They discuss a book that basically dismisses UFOs, written by this guy, Garrett Graff, who, as they point out, was supposedly involved in downplaying the whole Hunter Biden laptop story.
It makes you wonder, right, about hidden agendas and how easily information can be manipulated, especially in this day and age. What are your thoughts on that? Especially in light of everything else we've been talking about. It's wild, right? You start talking about controlling information and it's like this rabbit hole that just keeps going. It makes you wonder, are we all just wired to believe in conspiracies?
I mean, there's definitely something to that. This need to believe in something bigger than ourselves, whether it's a higher power, some secret society pulling the strings, or, yeah, even aliens. And Rogan, he's right there with us. He even shares a personal story about, get this, seeing what he believes might have been UFOs.
Hold on, seriously, what did he see?
He describes these weird, like, orange orbs in the sky, nothing that he could easily explain away. And the really strange thing is that these sightings seem to line up with a sudden spike in Google searches for, you guessed it, UFOs. Oh, and this phrase, immaculate constellation, which, oddly enough, he'd been researching around that same time.
Okay, that's kind of creepy, I'm not going to lie. Makes you wonder if there's more to these stories than we realize.
Right. And that brings us back to this whole idea of truth and whether some truths are just too big, too much for us to handle. Rogan and Shellenberger, they even ponder this. What if the government came out tomorrow and confirmed definitively that we're not alone? Not just microbial life out there, but like full-blown advanced civilizations. Would we even be able to process that?
Talk about a paradigm shift. It would rock our world, that's for sure. Which begs the question, is ignorance bliss? Is there such a thing as information that's too dangerous, too disruptive to be out in the open?
It's a question that's been debated for ages, right? And there's no easy answer. But it speaks to this responsibility we have, both as individuals and as a society, when it comes to knowledge. Who gets to decide what we know, what we're ready for?
It's a lot to unpack, and if this conversation has taught me anything, it's that we can't just be passive consumers of information. We've got to be critical thinkers, question our assumptions, seek out different perspectives.
Couldn't agree more. And that's the beauty of a deep dive like this, right? It's not about telling you what to think, but giving you the information, the different angles, so you can form your own conclusions.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive on free speech, censorship, conspiracies, the whole shebang, what are some key takeaways you hope our listeners walk away with?
Well, first off, remember that this battle over information, it's not new. It's been going on for centuries. And the internet, social media, it's just the latest battleground.
Totally. Used to be hiding printing presses, now it's algorithms and shadow bans, same game, different tools.
Exactly. And second, be wary of anyone claiming to have all the answers, whether it's someone in a position of power or, just that guy on Twitter with a lot of followers.
Healthy skepticism, right?
Right.
Question everything, especially if it seems a little too good or a little too crazy to be true.
Exactly. And finally, remember that even institutions, even those with the best of intentions, can get it wrong. So don't be afraid to challenge the status quo, to think for yourself, and to seek out those dissenting voices.
Because ultimately, the search for truth, it's a journey, not a destination. And as Rogan and Shellenberger have shown us, it's a journey that can take you to some pretty unexpected and thought-provoking places. So stay curious, keep asking those tough questions, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.